He had always believed he was in control of his life. From a young age, he learned that money was power, and power was freedom. Raphael, a common name for a man who was anything but ordinary in the business world, built his fortune without ever looking back. He sold counterfeit shoes on the internet, advertised as genuine, deceiving thousands of customers without a shred of remorse. His motto was simple: if people are foolish enough to fall, that's their problem. He never considered himself a bad person. He wasn't directly stealing, only exploiting other people's stupidity. To him, morality was a relative concept, and religion a waste of time. God, heaven and hell were just stories told by weak people who needed something to hold on to. That night, he was staying at one of the most expensive resorts in the Caribbean, enjoying the luxury that dirty money could buy. His room had a panoramic view of the ocean. The pool lights reflected like liquid sapphires, and a bottle of imported whiskey rested on the table beside him. Everything was perfect. After another day of easy profit, he decided to take a nighttime swim to relax. He took a generous gulp of his drink, removed his shirt, and dove headfirst into the shimmering blue water. But due to a miscalculation, his body violently collided with the bottom of the pool. The impact was brutal. A dull thud echoed in his head, as if his skull had been crushed by an invisible hammer. The pain was so intense that it seemed to pierce every nerve in his body, radiating like an uncontrollable electric shock. For a moment, everything fell silent. The water around him seemed to have become thick, almost solid, suffocating his lungs like liquid cement. Raphael tried to move, but his limbs wouldn't respond. A cold despair took hold of him. He knew he needed to surface, but his body refused to obey. The glow of the pool lights began to distort, shattering into abstract patterns that flickered like bulbs about to burn out. It was then that he realized something terrible. His vision was fading. The crystalline blue of the water started to darken, slowly being swallowed by an oppressive shadow that seemed to emerge out of nowhere. It wasn't just unconsciousness setting in, it was something more, something alive. Suddenly, Raphael felt an indescribable sensation. It was as if his body had been torn away from him, like a piece of clothing being violently ripped off. The pool, the water, the resort, everything disappeared in an instant. He was floating, not figuratively but literally. His consciousness hovered above his own body, watching it lie motionless in the pool, while the water gently rippled around him. His chest didn't move, his eyes were half closed, and a trail of blood slowly dissipated in the water. It was an absurd, unacceptable sight. He wanted to scream, to shake his body, to force himself back. But there was no sound, no touch, no sensation to indicate that he was still part of the physical world. That's when the true terror began. An unfamiliar chill crawled over his skin, even though he was no longer inside his own body. And before he could even begin to understand what was happening, he felt a presence. It wasn't human. It wasn't comforting. It was something ancient, vast, and indescribably dark. The presence was drawing near. Raphael couldn't see it, but he felt it as clearly as the very fear that was starting to consume his mind. It was as if the air around him had gained weight, suffocating, dense, charged with something malevolent. The absolute silence made everything even worse. There was no water, no wind, no sound to distract him from that growing horror. Suddenly, an invisible force began to pull him downward, as if cold, relentless hands were clasping his ankles, dragging him into an unseen abyss. Raphael tried to resist, but it was useless. His body, or what remained of it, was motionless, captive to a force that did not belong to this world. The darkness around him began to shift, oscillating like liquid shadows, revealing something that made his heart, if he still had one, freeze. He wasn't alone. Out of nowhere, figures began to form in the midst of that vast blackness. At first, they were only vague shapes, like shadows in the fog. But as they approached, their outlines became clearer. They were people, or at least what had once been human. Their eyes were dark, bottomless voids, lifeless. Their bodies were contorted into impossible angles, like broken puppets hanging in the void. They murmured words that Raphael couldn't understand, hoarse, fragmented voices as if they belonged to mouths that hadn't spoken in centuries. He wanted to run, to scream, to escape that nightmare, but something held him back, a paralyzing horror that rooted deeply in his soul. This was not just a vision, it was real. The figures moved closer and closer, and with them, a horrible stench filled the air, a mixture of burnt flesh and decay, something so nauseating that it seemed to corrode Raphael's very thoughts. He tried to retreat, but there was nowhere to go. The space around him was an infinite void, with no ground, no sky, no point of reference, only those deformed, agonizing souls now stretching their cadaverous hands toward him. Their fingers were long and skeletal, some without skin, others appearing to be fused to something grotesque, as if trapped in an endless cycle of decay and regeneration. Raphael wanted to close his eyes, but he couldn't. He was doomed to witness it all. With every step those creatures took, something inside him shattered, as if the very essence of his being was being torn away, bit by bit. Then a sound cut through the absolute silence. It was a scream. Not an ordinary scream, it was a sound of pure despair, laden with a suffering so deep that it seemed to slice through Raphael like a sharp blade. He turned his head and saw it. Ahead, a massive fissure had opened from nothing, a blazing abyss pulsating. Like an evil heart. Within it, souls were falling continuously, like raindrops in an ocean of fire. Some desperately tried to climb the black walls of the precipice, but shadowy hands emerged from the flames to pull them back, condemning them to an eternal fall. The screams echoed everywhere, a chorus of torment that never ceased. Raphael felt his chest tighten. The air around him grew even heavier, and a terrible truth crept into his mind. He wasn't just seeing that place. He was being taken there. Raphael tried to fight against the invisible force, dragging him toward the abyss, but it was like trying to resist a violent current. His body, or soul, whatever it was now, was inexorably being dragged into that pit of pure despair. The temperature around him began to rise in a suffocating manner, and he felt his skin, or what was left of it, tingle as if it were about to ignite. But the worst wasn't the physical pain. It was the cruel, undeniable realization that this wasn't a dream, not a hallucination. It was real. For the first time in his life, Raphael felt a fear that could not be rationalized or ignored. An ancient, visceral fear that gnawed at every fiber of his being. He looked around, searching for an escape, anything that could stop him, but saw only more souls being devoured by the fire, screaming for help that would never come. Then he saw something that made his stomach churn. Among the twisting shadows in that hell, there was a familiar face. At first, he couldn't recognize it, but as his eyes adjusted to the darkness, his heart sank. It was his grandmother, the same woman who had raised him with such tenderness, who always smiled at him during childhood Christmases, who baked his favorite cake on his birthdays. But now she was nothing more than a shadow of what she once was. Her face was contorted in an expression of endless agony. Her eyes, once full of tenderness, now reflected an absolute void. She was trapped there, like all the others. Raphael wanted to call out to her, to run to her, to hold her, to pull her out of that damnation. But when he tried to take a step forward, a cold voice sounded by his side, paralyzing him. The voice was deep, emotionless, laden with a power that made every particle of Raphael's existence shudder. "She made her choices," said the presence beside him. He didn't need to ask who was speaking. He knew. A terrifying understanding took hold of his mind, as if the universe itself were revealing an undeniable truth. Raphael tried to protest, but his voice failed him. He wanted to scream that his grandmother was a good person, that she helped others, that she had never hurt anyone. But then the voice spoke again, sharp as a cold blade. "Good works without me are dead." Raphael couldn't understand. How could something like that be fair? How could such a generous woman be there? But as he looked around, he realized he wasn't the only one thinking so. Thousands of souls were in that same condition. People who had lived believing they were good enough on their own, never accepting that there was something greater than them. Desperation took over him. If even his grandmother was condemned, what did that mean for him? The answer came before he could form the question. The force pulling him intensified, and Raphael felt he was about to be cast into the abyss. His skin began to burn, not with fire, but with a heat that seemed to come from within, as if his very essence were being consumed. Then the laughter began, first low, distant, but growing rapidly until it became a deafening sound. A malignant, cruel laugh that reverberated all around. And then he saw it, a silhouette seated upon an imposing throne, made of living shadows that writhed like serpents. Two red eyes shone in the darkness, fixing on him with a sickening satisfaction. "You have always belonged to me," said the figure, and at that moment, Raphael knew exactly who stood before him. Time seemed to freeze as Raphael stared at the entity now claiming him. Satan's gaze pierced his soul like a burning dagger, exposing every mistake, every lie, every act of greed and corruption he had committed throughout his life. There were no justifications there, no excuses that could be given. Everything was laid bare before that overwhelming presence, and Raphael realized he had never truly been in control of anything. His success, his independence, his belief that he could live without consequences, everything crumbled in an instant. He tried to back away, but the shadows began to envelop him like sticky hands, squeezing him, suffocating him. The laughter continued, growing louder and louder, reverberating throughout the darkness. Satan raised a hand, and Raphael felt a tug so strong that his very being seemed to shatter. He was on the verge of falling. And then, in one final act of despair, Raphael did something he had never done sincerely in his entire life. He cried out, "Jesus, help me!" His voice echoed through the void, and for a second nothing happened. But then, as if an invisible dam had broken, a light exploded around him, so intense that the darkness was torn apart like a fragile veil. Raphael felt the shadows recede, the screams cease, the weight on his body dissipate. Satan roared in anger, his once blazing eyes now reflecting pure hatred and impotence. Raphael was yanked away with an indescribable force, as if being pulled out of a nightmare. Hell vanished, and he emerged in a vast, verdant field, where the air was pure and the silence brought peace, not terror. He collapsed to his knees, gasping, trying to process what had happened. When he lifted his eyes, he saw a figure before him. There was no need to ask who it was. He already knew. Jesus was there, standing before him, and his gaze carried something Raphael had never seen before, a mixture of infinite compassion and immutable justice. There was no anger, no condemnation, only the truth. Raphael felt tears streaming down his face, but they were not tears of pain or fear, rather of something new, something he had never experienced before, genuine repentance. For the first time in his life, he understood what truly mattered. Money, power, arrogance, none of that meant anything in the face of eternity. The only thing that mattered was the choice each person made regarding the one who now stood before him. He wanted to speak, to beg for a second chance, but Jesus simply extended his hand. The moment Raphael touched that hand, everything vanished. He woke up with a jolt, violently coughing as he felt air filling his lungs again. Someone was shouting for help. Hands were shaking him in desperation. He blinked several times, confused, before realizing where he was, still in the resort's pool. The water reflected the nightlights, but something inside him had changed forever. Raphael was no longer the same. Hell was real, But now he knew that salvation was too. He staggered out of the pool, breathing with difficulty, feeling each heartbeat as a reminder that he was still alive, but not by his own strength. He had been saved, not by merit, but by the mercy of the one he had spent his whole life ignoring. And now, with a new purpose burning inside him, Raphael knew exactly what he needed to do: tell the world what he had seen before it was too late for anyone else.